From the studios of KENW on the campus of Eastern New Mexico University, it's You Should Know, featuring the people and events of Eastern New Mexico and West Texas.
With me now is Dr. Manuel Varela and also Dr. Michael Shaughnessy. And these two gentlemen are authors, and good ones, and prolific. And they have a new book out. We're going to talk about their new book, and then we're going to talk about something that has to do with microbiological science, and that's going to be what's happening with COVID. So it's going to be a good show. And Manny, you mind if I call you Manny?
Sure.
Okay.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right.
Yeah.
That's Dr. Varela. Whenever I'm speaking to Manny, that's who we're talking about. The subject matter comes from you. Tell me about the book title and what's
We
in
have
it.
one that's coming out this month. It's not here yet, but it's called The World of Molecular Biology. And my lovely wife, Anne, was recruited by Dr. Shaughnessy to work with us about it. And we have one on biochemistry. We have one about microbiology. We have one about our favorite scientists. And we have another one about biomedical science. And so these are all books that Dr. Shaughnessy made happen for us. And so we're just so grateful to him for providing this opportunity for us to work on. It's our favorite thing to do.
Okay. Dr. Shaughnessy, or Michael, or Mike. Yeah. Anyway, tell me about, I know you've done these books with other doctors, other specialists here on the campus as well, plus your own writings are big stack. How did you get interested in doing that, and what is it that you help Manny with?
Well, basically, we were sitting down one Christmas party, I think it was, at the university, and we were just talking about science in general and the need to educate people out there about science, scientists, the lives of scientists, where they came from, what they discovered, why their discoveries were so important, and how their discoveries impact us even today. For example, Marie Curie, X-ray technology. I mean, there must be, every hospital in the world uses Marie Curie's discoveries of X-rays to look inside the human body. And those discoveries have kind of taken off to CAT scans, computer axial tomographies, magnetic resonance, SPECT scans to look inside the brain. So you have one woman who's impacted the entire world and continues to impact the entire world. And all of the authors that we have kind of looked at, they've contributed something to science in some way or another, either through genetics or microbiology or molecular biology. And their discoveries impact us even today in the field of virology that Dr. Varela teaches.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, let's mention some of the things. Mad cow disease. Okay, Manny, would you tell me what did you write in that book about mad cow disease, and what can we learn from what you have written there?
Okay. Well, it turns out that the mad cow disease is not really a bunch of angry cows. It's really a bunch of crazy cows. Because in England, where they emerged, when you say someone's crazy, they've gone mad. But the technical term is bovine encephalopathy, BSE, or no, bovine spongiform encephalopathy, BSE. And it's basically when you render cattle and that's infected with these prion proteins, they survive the rendering process, and people might eat them and acquire a brain that looks like a sponge. And so you kind of have these neurological defects. We're trying very hard to not make that happen here in the States.
And in the book, you mentioned that if it's read, by someone who's going to travel to other countries, they'll know whether or not they should spend any time with cattle. They're beautiful little Scottish cattle. I just love, the ones that look like they have a hippie haircut. And what about that? When we go over to Europe visiting, should we avoid animals?
Well, in the airports in the old days, about 10, 20 years ago, they would always stop and ask you, have you been on a farm? Have you been in contact with animals? And they would want to screen individuals coming from other countries, going to other countries. They actually had a mat where you could clean your shoes because they were concerned about coming or bringing ground or dust or something in from another country. But I remember that just like today, nowadays, they'll screen you, they'll take your temperature. If you go to the hospital, they'll screen you, they'll take your temperature, and they'll ask you a bunch of questions, have you had a temperature or a fever? Have you been coughing? Has there been a fever? So these are all screening kinds of things that kind of started years ago. And this really is the historical thing where ships would come into ports and the sailors would get off and people would notice lumps on their glands, their lymph nodes. They had boils and abscesses. And that's kind of where the Black Death kind of came from. They would see these black splotches on the human body. And they determined back then that we had to quarantine these sailors and not let them off the boat. They were quarantined for 30 or 40 days. So that was the beginning of mankind's attempt to control these viral things like leprosy and what they called, and Manny referred to London. They had a massive plague in London around 1665. Now, what cured that plague during that time period was the Great Fire. Back in those days, people would throw urine and fecal matter out of their windows into the gutters. Yeah. And that stuff would kind of stay there, and you'd have rats running around. And back then, the theory was that somehow fleas got on the rats, and the rats would kind of transport the disease all around the city of London. Then they had the Great Fire. And they thought that, well, maybe the Great Fire stopped this transmission of diseases in London at that time. Nowadays, we have antiviral agents and other medications to help with the curative factor.
Well, great. And where do you get your questions?
Well, I look at some things that are just relevant and important nowadays. We look at where these people came from. For example, one of the most well-known virologists is a guy named Salvador Luria, who was born in Turin, Italy. And as we kind of do research, we find out that some of the greatest scientists come from the smallest places. For example, there's a guy named George Beadle who comes from a place called Wahoo, Nebraska. Now, the good thing about that is, and how I relate to him, is he went to the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, which is my alma mater. I went there, but he did his undergraduate work, his graduate work there, and he grew up on a farm. And although his parents raised strawberries and asparagus and potatoes, he's most well known for his work with corn and the hybridization of corn and looking at the development of corn.
Okay. Well, Manny, what are you teaching now that will help students who become doctors, and I know that happens a lot here at Eastern. What are you teaching that'll help them understand this tiny little world that they look at through the microscopes?
Well, I teach them a course called microbiology, and that surveys all the microbes, their genetics, their metabolism, the immune system, the pathogenesis. I teach a course called medical microbiology. Some folks call it infection. It's the same thing that you would get in medical school. And we discuss all the dangerous pathogens, all the dangerous microbes. I teach a course called immunology, which is the study of how the body fends itself off against the microbes and cancer. I teach a course called virology, which is just the viruses because they're so pathogenic and they're dangerous to just about everything. There's a virus that will infect every living known organism to mankind. Trees, bacteria, they infect other viruses. They infect fungi, algae, humans, and maybe only certain human cells.
There's a wonderful children's book that reminds me of what you're showing these people how to do. It's called Horton Hears a Who. And Horton hears this, he's got big ears, he's an elephant, and he hears these little people, and it opens up a whole new world for Horton to get acquainted with the Who's. And what you're doing in your class is teaching those students how to relate to that whole new world, isn't it?
Well, that's what Dr. Shaughnessy came up with in one of these books. Welcome to the world of microbiology.
Go ahead.
For example, with the coronavirus, in looking at the coronavirus, it does have this type of crown around it that made it almost distinctive and different from SARS, which was kind of its predecessor, which kind of led now to COVID-19. And we still are hearing about slight mutations are picked up maybe over in England and other countries, because these viruses do seem to change and mutate and grow and reinfect.
Wow. Okay. Well, let's talk about the book right now. Where can people get a copy of the book? Where should they look?
Well, they can go to Amazon or Google Books,
Nova Sciences.
Barnes & Noble,
Right.
Okay.
Nova Science.
And just enter either one of your names, or just talk about science. It should be listed under any one of those searches for them.
That's correct.
Very good, very good. Okay, now what I'd like to do is talk about COVID-19, talk about the pandemic, and what I want to ask both of you, and Manny, I'll start with you. What do you think history is going to look at when they look back in 20 years on what has happened in 2020 and is still happening in 2021 to the world of medicine, since you work with the doctors and people?
Okay. Well, I think hopefully we've learned some lessons from this pandemic. Number one, maybe quarantine a little bit earlier, respond just a little bit sooner, close up a little bit sooner. Listen to the scientists who have an MD or a PhD or an expertise in viruses or infectious diseases or vaccine biology, biomedical sciences, microbiology, not just any old person with a related topic. We hope that we can, well, I should say the vaccines that we're using now are the result of 50, 20 years worth of basic research, just basic sciences. The curiosity that scientists have led to discoveries like CRISPR and the RNA as a means of invoking a vaccine, viral vectors, other vaccines, other antimicrobial agents, antivirals. We have medicines now that stop the coronavirus that are in the pipeline from attaching to a cell and getting into a cell. We have some medicines that are in the pipeline that prevent the RNA protein that surrounds the RNA genome from protecting it. We have some medicines in the pipeline now that are keeping the RNA protein, the ribonuclear protein, from being processed. We call those protease inhibitors, and that might prevent the infection. We have medicines in the pipeline now that prevent the RNA from being transcribed or translated or replicated, and those are all in the pipeline. So we have so even if these variants do emerge, and maybe where the vaccines may or may not work on them, we still got some other fires and coals in the fire to help us fight these changing viruses.
Basically, we're learning a lot.
Yeah, we're learning
Even though
lessons.
this was a terrible price to pay, but we are learning a lot from this situation. Michael, your expertise is in psychology, and do you think, first of all, let me ask you, do you think that when they started doing the lockdowns, all of this kind of thing, that they had taken the time to consider how it would affect our population and the population of the world with the lockdown, keeping places closed, the stores were hard to get into, What do you think that did?
To a certain extent, it was what I would call a panic or a knee-jerk reaction. But you also need to understand that cities like New York and Chicago and Detroit are very highly congested. In other words, you have people right next to each other, so the chances and probability of catching the COVID-19 thing are much greater in New York City, where people are in a subway car, they're coming out of a subway, and there's hundreds of people. So the chances and probability are much greater in New York than they are in Floyd or Elida or Dora, where people are relatively isolated. But we have learned a lot, I think, like Dr. Brilla has said. We survived the HIV/AIDS. For many, many years, there was a big concern about sexually transmitted diseases, and people were dying of AIDS, but we did learn, people did research, they began to develop drugs that attack and work with those individuals who have contracted that either Spanish flu, because again, historically, we have dealt with Spanish flu and Russian flu and other variants of the flu.
Yeah, we learned a lot from the Spanish flu. We learned to screen and test for people who might have the flu, and if they tested positive, we tell their family, their coworkers, their associates, their close contacts to quarantine, and we typically stem those outbreaks. And we've been doing that ever since the 1918, 1919 flu. So every time we have a pandemic, we have this protocol. And this time, this pandemic, we kind of didn't follow that. So had we done that sooner and closed down sooner, we would have opened up sooner.
I believe this is the first time we have closed schools en masse.
Right.
And that had a really bad effect.
Correct.
Not a good, well, it may have kept some people from getting sick, indeed, but it had a bad effect because our percentages of family fights.
Well, first of all, the human brain does not like change.
Yes.
The human body doesn't like change. We have a medical term, homeostasis, that we want to keep things kind of balanced. We want to keep things in a nice structure, consistency, and routine. So this has really impacted all of these students who all of a sudden, they can't participate in sports, they can't do their dance, theater, drama, they can't do their music. So this has been a real emotional impact. And then families who are having to take over the educational function either through Zoom or Microsoft Teams or some other internet. This has caused a lot of stress. And obviously stress is another thing that is not good for the human body and psychologically. It's not good for parents to have to be both a parent and a teacher and a disciplinarian all at the same time. And what has also happened is students have gotten out of habits. Habits are really important for us to kind of keep reading, keep studying, keep learning. And once those habits are disrupted, then that's when you have this loss of learning, and how we're going to regain and recapture what has been lost is the challenge that teachers are going to find when students arrive back in the fall.
You teach students how to handle classrooms. I've watched your classes all a long time, and you do such a good job. Are there going to be people in the schools that are going to be able to help these parents? They're just getting started in New Mexico now. They haven't been back to school very long. There's going to be some problems, aren't there?
There's going to be some what we call adjustments. We call this adjustment reaction, that people have to readjust to a new kind of situation. They're going to have to readjust to a new structure, consistency, routine, and hopefully the guidance counselors, the principals, school psychologists will all try to help teachers reestablish that consistency, to have a good rapport with students, to reestablish that relationship and reorganize them, so to speak, to get them in the frame of mind of being able to learn and then to recapture what they haven't learned, and that love for learning, that this is a good place to learn, this is a good place to get information. We're preparing students to be medical doctors, nurses, x-ray technicians, etc. We have a great nursing program here at Eastern that I'm partially involved with. So we're trying to prepare those future professionals to cope with whatever might be transpiring, 5, 10 years down the road. We've learned a lot from AIDS, we've learned a lot from SARS and the coronavirus.
We might want to mention that we need to consider the teachers in all of this too. I have spoken with teachers who are just really frustrated.
Right.
They just don't know what to do.
Right.
And so they're going to need some help in the future as well.
They're going to need some support, and they're going to need some assistance from their principals, and they're going to need to work at this. It's going to take some time to reestablish that consistency and structure and routine and classroom management.
Manny, we're down to about 4 minutes, and would you give a plug for vaccinations? Because I know a lot of people who didn't want to get one, and they say, I'm not going to do this sort of thing. Why should people get a vaccination?
Well, I think if the majority of people get a vaccine, we will acquire herd immunity, and we will not survive this pandemic unless we have herd immunity. And that just means that the vast majority of the populace is immune. And the only way to do it is to vaccinate. And the vaccines are safe. You won't get coronavirus. You won't get COVID-19. It won't change your DNA. It won't turn you into a zombie. But you will mount an immune response that will help you should you encounter the SARS-CoV vaccine virus. Mm-hmm. The RNA vaccines are just RNA, and it goes into your cell. It makes the spike protein. It gets detected. The immune response responds to it, making antibodies and T cells, and it remembers the next time if you get the real virus. And the same thing with the viral vectors.
Michael, how do you overcome fear in people? What should we be telling them now? Besides, listen, we got to do this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, people have been getting vaccinated now against polio. They've been getting vaccinated against the measles, mumps, rubella virus. Smallpox. They've been getting vaccinated against smallpox and a whole number of other things. And the vast majority have been safe. There's been research done. In fact, some of our previous students have actually been involved up at UNM with researching the coronavirus. But there's a long, long history now, and we have the science behind the vaccinations. And we have different companies like Johnson & Johnson. They only have one shot. And it seems that some people have a small reaction to the second vaccination. And that's somewhat to be expected when you're injecting something into the human body. But it's long-term that we're concerned about, long-term prevention, particularly those individuals who might have some type of upper respiratory or COPD or bronchi or stridor or phenoritis, if they have asthma or hay fever. Those are the people that are at risk. Those are the individuals that, in addition to the elderly, who have a propensity to pneumonia, that we really need to protect them, and we really need to make sure that those people with asthma and hay fever and allergies, they are the ones, because they have the weakened immune system. In a sense, this is the immunology side of the equation.
We really want to look for the herd immunity,
right,
and be able to make ourselves safe from that kind of thing in the future. And we need to consider the psychology behind what we do to prevent this.
We need to be vigilant, and the term is constant vigilance, and I think that's what's going to be happening now. We want to be constantly vigilant about viruses.
Okay. Well, thank you both for coming, and I hope that people will buy your book. It's one of those that's very nice to have on the shelf. If somebody comes in the house and is spinning around, rolling on the floor, you might want to look up in that book just exactly what makes people do that, you know, that sort of thing. And you'd be like Dr. House on the House series. You'd be able to solve that mystery in the medical field.
Area, right.
Thank you both very much for
Thank
being
you.
here with us.
For having us. We greatly
Appreciate it.
appreciate it.
Yeah.